Chapter 26. Prophets in the Wilderness. The new guardsmen were understandably disturbed by the baptism and execution of the raider. I, on the other hand, was more concerned that the gunshot would draw others towards us. I did my best to muffle the gunshot by placing the barrel firmly under the raider's chin, and my worries about the trajectory were void, since it apparently had the intended effect when he moved no more. As the others stood, Rhines was seemingly satisfied by the muffling of the gunshot, and Granger was evidently a bit more collected than his comrades because he was kind enough to refill my impromptu baptism canteen, while I sat momentarily captured by the raider's face. The face the recently baptized and killed wore after the bullet exited the top of his skull was the same one he wore beforehand. It was utterly indifferent. Either way, he was with God, facing his judgment, and only a few short seconds passed before I returned to my responsibilities toward the living. Upon standing, the new men were relatively distant, exchanging quiet words about the affair while looking around, at the scene of battle surrounding this old gas station. "Should probably head out soon," said Rhines. I looked at him, nodded in agreement, and my eyes went towards the north when my heart skipped a beat. "Where's Logan?" I asked, staring at the spot just past the campfire and tray of raw meat, where he previously stood watch over the north. Rhines, Savitt, and the new men looked at me in terror as I began trotting towards that spot and shouted, "Logan! Barnett! Where are you?" I began to sprint, passing the site around the pump, and reached the now-dead campfire where that raw meat sat on a tray before I heard a somewhat near response. "Over here, LT. Come take a look at this." My mood went from terror to anger the second his voice entered my ears. I rounded the corner of the gas station building, hearing the thudding footsteps of the others following, when I caught up to Barnett staring at something between the dumpsters on this side of the building. "Why on earth didn't you say something before leaving our site?" I was going to. I couldn't help but trail off when I saw what he was looking at. He just stared at this heap of flesh, and it honestly took me a moment for my brain to register what I was looking at. The footsteps came to a halt behind me and Barnett. Silence lingered for a moment, as we all took in the sight. "Is it dead?" asked Mr. Fleischer. "That one looks so," said Rhines. There between the two dumpsters were two large brown scaly-skinned animals splayed out with long arms, hands over 5 times as big and long as ours, with long claws and legs stretched out with more giant claws on the feet. One lay belly up, spattered in blood, and with large chunks carved out of its abdomen. This one was smaller than the other, which lay upon the pile of trash and debris from the building. The larger one sat curled in a fetal-like position, but its long, horned tail went along the pile of trash and into the open dumpster on the right. Both lay there full of bullet holes. The splayed-out one didn't have a head visible to us where we stood, but the other one sat with its head propped up on a small pile of cinder blocks as its white eyes, terrible teeth, horned head, and devilish face stared right at me. "Ain't seen a deathclaw in a while," said Savitt. "I didn't really think they were real," said Mr. Hansley. "Are they good? To eat, I mean?" asked Granger. I thought back to the tray of meat beside the fire before the 80s attack, and the scene made a bit more sense. A sense that was articulated by Rhines, who said half-jokingly, "Don't you hate it when the 80s interrupt your Deathclaw barbecue?" The new men forced a chuckle, probably grateful for a little distraction from the horror they'd seen since arriving at this place. It was only Barnett and I who remained quiet. My eyes went briefly to the carved-out chunks of the splayed-out Deathclaw at the mention of the meat, but they seemed to be driven right back to those white eyes of the beast that stared into Barnett and I. I looked into the eyes of that terrible creature and heard the words, "Is it dead?" echo in the back of my mind. As soon as I heard this again, I thought of all the dead I'd seen around this patch of the wilderness. I thought a lot about the defiled and mutilated woman by the pump, and then the face of the wounded raider after the bullet passed through his brain. Then I thought of a past I hadn't seen firsthand that merged with what I had seen. I saw the white legs taking down these deadly mutant creatures, ready to indulge in the spoils of their victory around the campfire before the 80s interrupted them. A sudden crisp breeze hit my cheek, and for whatever reason, I began to think of Michelle at the same time I thought about how every dead thing around this gas station got what they deserved. I thought back to something I hadn't had time to think about during this whole trip. Between teaching the new men the duties of the road, I had busied myself with so much on this 2-week trip that I hadn't been able to consider, till looking into the white eyes of that still beast between the two dumpsters. I remembered that early morning, the day Michelle left, The sun wasn't even a glimmer above the east when Danny and I stood with Michelle beside the little gate to our front yard. We were counting down the minutes until Mr. Padilla would arrive with Sarah Parsons to meet up with their escorts and head out to the Sorrows tribe of Zion. As I stood there with Danny, Michelle was standing slightly distant, nearly hopping up and down in eagerness to depart. It was then that Danny whispered to me something I'd forgotten after the departure ceremony, and again at the party that night. She pulled the little box she brought to the ceremony from the large pocket of her sleeping robes. Danny handed it to me and whispered, "I think it's best that you give it to her, It's now or never." I couldn't tell if the tear in her eye was because of the bitterness of the cold wind, the thought of her baby leaving for the dangerous wilderness, or the contents of the departure gift. But perhaps it was all three. The memory hit me as the present was placed in my hands, and I looked up to see two figures coming towards us down the street in the light of the lamps. Michelle turned to us, about to say she was going to run and meet them, but I told her to come here, and she obeyed. She kept stealing glances towards her oncoming friend and escort, but I captured her attention when I handed her the box with the words, "Your mom and I have one more gift for you." She looked down at the box and then up to us for permission, and Danny was too emotional to say anything else, so I nodded permission to open it. Michelle tore off the brown wrapping paper, and Danny collected the trash under her shawl before Michelle lifted the lid up and became confused. Her confused expression only lasted a second before the reality of the gift cemented itself, and her eyes became resolute with determination. Danny leaned on me, making short glances at the figures just reaching the edge of our neighbor's fence, and I told Michelle, "I know it's been a while since you and I have gone shooting, but I know you know how to work that, and I want you to keep that on you at all times when you're out there." She looked at me in a way that told me she was no longer my baby girl, but knew she would remain my baby girl forever. I gulped, the departure of my eldest daughter now hitting me even harder as her face studied my own worry. "Go ahead, take it out. Keep it safe and keep it in a place you can always reach it." Michelle lifted the small .45 pistol out of the box and removed the 2 loaded magazines before setting the box down. In an effort to keep myself from succumbing to emotional devastation, I couldn't help but go on about the weapon. "It's just like the one your dad uses on watch, just a little smaller since my hands are bigger than yours, huh?" It was hard to conceal my tears behind the chuckle at the end, and the whole thing was even harder to handle when I saw how she handled the weapon. Just like I taught her many months ago, she kept her finger straight and off the trigger, and the barrel downward. She checked the chamber after a moment and placed the thing in the front pouch of her travel satchel before throwing her arms around me, saying, "Thanks, Dad. I'll stay safe, I promise." Before releasing her embrace, she kissed my cheek and then threw her arms around her mother. Danny wept, and Michelle placed 100 kisses on her mom's cheek before her friend and the missionary, Mr. Padilla, stepped up to us. It was time for her to go, and I can only remember walking Danny back to the warmth of our home as Michelle departed, and I assured Danny that she would be fine. I truly believed it when I told Danny those things. I assured her that the wastes were much calmer than they were when she and I were going on our first missions. As I've said in previous sections, it was never my intention to lie, ever, but maybe things were more peaceful than they were in my youth. However, that seemed pretty hard to believe when I thought of all the death that surrounded us at this little rundown gas station. Man had triumphed over the worst creatures, like these between the dumpsters, then man had fallen to man in savage thirst for blood, and here we were staring at the remnants. Barnett had broken himself free from the Deathclaw's eyes, and we must have all been taking in the scene for only a minute before he answered Mr. Fleischer's question. "I think it's dead." Logan moved over towards the left side of the beast on the trash pile, and I was firmly returned to the moment. At the same time, the men's hearts froze. The head of the Deathclaw painfully followed Mr. Barnett, and there we noticed the chest of the beast going in then out almost imperceptibly. Mr. Hansley and Rhines let out a short scream that they immediately caught, and it occurred to me that this beast was the mother, and the shorter one with the chunks carved out was the child. The mother watched her child get killed and carved to pieces by raiders it couldn't save its baby from, but remained alive long enough to watch the killers get their dues by men who would have done the exact same thing to her and her baby. I watched the white eyes of the mother Deathclaw follow the motions of Mr. Barnett's slowly waving arms, and the calm chest went in then out again and again as the rest of the men placed themselves another 20 feet of distance. All at once, I said to the wind, "We need to go, and I don't much care to write any more about this time in my life."
About 2 or 3 days later. Narrative continued through the personal diary of Nathan Porter of the new Canaan Guard. Read by Joshua Graham, former legatus of Caesar's Legion, and son of New Canaan. It's not often I write in my journal, but I still do it here and there. I think I swore I'd never write again after all the notes about my first mission were completed a few years back. I still write here and there, but only if it's about big things. Like, I wrote a lot about Alianamitus Chronacana, and the time I was best man for Diego Marquez. That was fun, but I think the last thing I wrote about was when I learned that the guy Paul dragged in from the desert was Joshua Graham. That was wild. Anyway, Paul wasn't himself after getting back from that trip with the new guys, and it made a lot of sense when I learned why. Not to mention what happened an hour or two after he got back. It was pretty much any other day when they got back. John, Carl, Dean, Ramos, and me were manning the gate station for entry duty when we saw Paul and the others coming in. They would have been expected days ago, but Constable said Paul was taking the new guys out to get some experience for a few additional days. Paul had to head in immediately to report in with the Constable, but Carl, Dean, and I got the fun and details from Rhines and the new guys when they stayed by our gate station awaiting Paul's return. Overall, it sounded like things went really well for the new guys, so that was nice. They did see a couple of pretty grisly sights on the return trip. Like that thing around the gas station was pretty bad from everything they said, but it happens. The only one who still looked shook up about it was Hansley. But that was all right. I knew his parents, and I can only say that they were always a bit more protective than most parents in town. I was honestly pretty surprised that it was they who suggested he join the Guard in the first place. Anyway, we were shooting our mouths off about this and that for the better part of an hour. Then, it was about noon when Paul came back out telling Rhines to take the new guys inside to return some gear they borrowed, check in with the Constable and whatnot. Paul seemed pretty fine, and so did the rest of them, but in the end he had nothing but good things to say about how well the new men did and how Rhines and his boys served as instructors. The big thing was the baptism they did for the raider a few days ago. Paul agreed with our conclusion when he said Hansley seemed a bit shook up, and the other fellas started talking about all the messed up stuff we'd seen in the wasteland. I decided I'd check in with Hansley after the shift, since we all knew what it was like to see stuff like that for the first time. A baptism is usually such a wonderful thing, but it throws you out of your element when you see the baptism party time starting pistol pointed at the head of the newly saved. The Deathclaw incident sounded interesting, but Paul didn't have much to say about that, and I thought about how the last time I saw a Deathclaw was about 2 years ago. Luckily, John had brought the anti-material rifle with him on the escort job to the folks at Jude, so I didn't get a look at it beyond the .50 caliber tearing through it in the distance, creating a cloud of dust. John definitely took this moment at the gate station to remind me and Carl and Dean how we called him stupid for bringing that heavy rifle till we watched that Deathclaw's arm get ripped away in a little dust cloud. After this, Paul asked about Graham, and I pointed up to the tower while John went on about how he's been great up there. Paul wondered who he was accompanying in the tower since the rest of the detachment was down here at the gate station, or out with him for the escort job to 89 City. John thought Graham was with some of Camden's men, but I could have sworn that Kennedy's guys were up there. Regardless, the guys up there were too hard to make out with the noontime sun directly above, but Paul said he'd go up there to check in on him before he went and departed our company, and after talking about this, what happened next is pretty hard for me to talk about. I think it was pretty hard for everyone to talk about, but I can only imagine how hard it was for Paul to see this. It didn't look like much at first, especially because of how crowded the market was at this time when spring was getting so close. But all our attention turned when we saw a group of people coming towards us at the gates in an unusual condition. Ramos noticed it first, asking, "What's happening over here?" We saw the crowd splitting or making way, and the first we could see was one of Herbion's men on patrol in the markets, leading the way. When enough people had cleared, he shouted ahead towards us, "John, get that gate open and get someone over here now!" John leaned down to the electrical box on the table behind the barricade, flipped the switch, and the gates gave their signature opening creak, as I was already on my way towards Herbion's man with Carl and Paul. The crowds parted more and revealed 3 people trailing behind Herbion's man. 2 men in brown and black combat armor suits and wide-brimmed hats I'd seen on only a couple other occasions. both men on each side of a woman with long, straggly reddish-brown hair in torn-up jeans, and a flannel long sleeve covered in stains that looked like a mix of dry and fresh blood. The woman's feet were dragging behind her as the men in combat armor moved her forward with both her arms over their shoulders. Her head hung low, and the sight made me anxious for some reason I didn't yet know, even when I looked to my left only to see Carl beside me. Paul had stopped, and only my peripherals showed Paul standing several paces in the rear with both hands over his mouth. Carl and I both stormed past Herbion's man, whom I recognized as Clay, when he said, "Carl, Nathan, take over for those gents, would you?" Without any word, and without even really looking at the two soldier types, Carl and I wordlessly took the arms of the battered young woman and proceeded towards the gate. For whatever reason, I couldn't bring myself to look at the young woman, even shunning her in my peripherals as the transfer was made seamlessly between the strange soldiers to Carl and me. The gentle sobbing of the woman between us didn't make it easier, and still, I did my best not to think about her as I looked forward. Doing that didn't help either, since between us and the gate station was still a frozen Paul. My lieutenant's hands remained clasped over his mouth, but it didn't take more than a glance at his face for me to see how red it was, and how tears were streaming from his eyes beneath the visor of his cap. Just then, the words, "Don't worry, Michelle. You're home now," came from the voice of one of those soldiers behind us, and the crying of this young girl was all I could hear from that point forward. That day was a lot. It wasn't nearly over, but on our way inside and joined by Ramos, we ran into Rhines, Savitt, and Barnett, just as we stepped through the gates. The group of new Canaanites waiting to exit the town parted ways, and looked in shock at the sight of the wounded girl, trying to determine who she was as she cried and moaned in terrible pain between Carl and I. Rhines leaped into immediate action as he called for Savitt to go get the constable, for Logan to get Dr. Franklin outside the wall, and directed us to follow him to Dr. Stepp, whose clinic was on the south side of the town square. The poor girl sobbed and cried in pain, and the rest is a bit of a blur after Carl and I escorted her through the clinic doors and spoke with Dr. Stepp. Within 30 minutes, Michelle was stripped and changed into a patient gown. Chairs were overturned, nursing staff ran about in all directions, and the young girl was sedated. I remember how frightened, how angry she was, and my heart sank in its entirety when I saw one of the nurses shear off Michelle's clothes, exposing that fair skin stained in so much dirt and dried blood. I remember how frantic she was, the sound of her sobs and screams for her mother before the needle went in, and the sight of her limbs falling to her sides. Carl and I were escorted out shortly after this, and I don't think it was just my mind that was a blur, as Carl and I sat in the little hallway surrounded by wooden walls, only watching as the swarm of people like nurses, Dr. Franklin, Paul, Daniela, and Dr. Stepp entered or exited the room. I remember making eyes with Paul just as he passed, and I didn't even know what to make of it. I don't know if I should have said something, but I think there wasn't much to say since his face showed a devastation I hadn't seen in it since I joined his detachment over 5 years ago. Paul disappeared into the room with his daughter, and there Carl and I sat, the screams of that poor angel echoing in my mind over and over again. Matters weren't made any better when we saw his wife Danny enter the hall. The poor woman didn't even notice us as she entered Michelle's room with tears streaming down her cheeks. Looking at the closed door to the room Daniela had entered, there was simply nothing for Carl and me to do but wait on that bench outside. Under normal circumstances, we would have dropped off the injured person at this clinic or Dr. Franklin's, but this felt much different than a typical case. Paul, Danny, Michelle, Hannah, and Joseph were practically family to anyone who called themselves a guardsman. And I can only compare this incident to ones where our guardsmen returned with the bodies of our brothers, who were killed outside the walls. Time seemed to stop, and normal duties didn't have any weight when stuff like this happened. I think it was even worse, because whatever happened to reduce Michelle to that state happened to her. We knew awful things could happen to the Guard when they go out into that wilderness. But it's really easy to forget that the same things could happen to even the most precious of our homes. There on that bench, I couldn't help but think of the last time I saw Paul's eldest daughter. It was at the party the evening before her departure. The party definitely got a lot more fun, in my opinion, when I arrived, and when the other boys of the Guard showed up too. It was good to talk to Paul off duty, chat with Danny, the Parsons, and the boys at the party. When night arrived, the whole of both families and the entire detachment posted up around the fire, and it was a very nice time. Michelle sat with her friend Sarah, across from me and Ramos. It was really nice to see Michelle laughing and talking with Sarah, surrounded by her friends and family in the firelight. She was very pretty that night, in that flowery dress and furry jacket. I don't think I'm alone when I say it put smiles on all our faces to see just how excited she was for the mission in all her innocence. I can't help but mention that Michelle was objectively very pretty and wonderfully kind. It was actually that night by the fire that I had to correct Joseph on this when he got tired of running around and perched himself between Ramos and I. I'll admit it was super weird when out of the blue, Joseph turned to me and said, unlike a hyperactive 7-year-old, "Is Aliana really nice? My sister wouldn't be too sad at first if she married you." How the kid even knew the name of the pretty tribal girl I accidentally lost my virginity to at 18 is beyond me. That, and my brain was sent into a spin by the other thing he said. Thankfully, everyone around the fire was too lost in their own conversations to hear any of this, but I could only say in return, "Yeah, Aliana's nice, and I don't want to marry Michelle. But why would Michelle be sad, quote, at first if she married me?" Unfortunately, Joseph didn't answer my question as he immediately turned to Ramos on my left. "You're going to marry Kathy Alessandro. Sarah's going to be busy." Immediately, the child got hit with a pebble thrown by the Hughes boy from across the fire, so Joseph ran off to chase him, leaving Ramos and I bewildered. I had noticed Ramos looking at Sarah Parsons quite a lot that night, and there I remembered his mentioning of a certain girl he'd been talking to during many Guard Bible studies. Anyway, I don't have hidden feelings for Michelle, although if she and Paul both came on their knees asking me to marry her, I would send Aliana Mitaskronakana a final letter and consult Elder Larsdale about the situation immediately. Still, I wasn't alone in this feeling. Most of the members of the Guard have loved Michelle in some form or another, whether that was like a sister, a daughter, or a sweetheart. It was the same. Michelle was loved and adored by everyone who knew her, whether in town or in the ranks of the Guard, and it was really hard to compare the version of her from that night by the fire to the girl Carl and I had just brought in. One question did come to me, however, when I recalled that night of celebration. Why was Michelle's missionary partner, Sarah, going to be too busy to marry my friend Ramos? Sarah did set off with Michelle, and why was it only Michelle who returned? Whatever it was that brought Michelle back home in that condition made me feel the worst for Michelle, Sarah Parsons, and whoever was their missionary escort. I hadn't heard who that was at the moment. In the end, before I could contemplate any of this further, Carl and I both looked up to see the constable standing before us. The hulking giant commander of the new Canaan Guard was looking down at Carl and I, twisting the end of his mustache as his eyes were red and wet with knowledge of who was behind that door across from us. All he said was very calmly and full of restrained emotion. "Carl, Nathan, I need you boys up at the guardhouse outside. John and Rhines are making a log for the strangers' accounts of what happened to Michelle and her mission party. I'd like you boys to serve as witnesses." Carl and I looked at each other, and then up to the constable. "Right away, sir." Carl and I silently departed, and the door opened and shut as the constable entered Michelle's room. Only a brief glance through the closing door showed me Paul holding Danny before the still feet on that bed. It felt impossible to continue on with the normal day that I started this diary entry with. It was still only a little after 1 p.m., and Carl mentioned on the walk to the gate that it was always so strange when a normal day could be turned completely upside down in only a few short moments. I agreed wholeheartedly, and I think something told me that the day would not get any more normal when I saw the figure up on top of the West Tower staring down at us. The man was a silhouette, but I could not see the outline of a cap, and I think Carl and I both felt those eyes upon us. That man up there was not with Camden, or Kennedy's men. He was one of Paul's. He was one of New Canaan's. He had seen the whole thing. He watched us bring the sobbing shell of Michelle Young into the community, and watched all those people who loved and cared for her flock to the clinic from atop the tower. I waved at him just before we reached the gate, and he remained a watching statue just before the gate began to creak open. The guardhouse belonged to whoever was occupying the East Gate station that day, or whoever was in charge of pressing the button to open or close the gates. The sign was put up outside stating that nobody would enter the community for the rest of the day, unless on official New Canaan business. It was only Logan and Savitt who stood watch behind the barricade, both of whom gave Carl and me a nod as we passed them and stepped into the guardhouse. That structure wasn't much. It was merely a small brick shack built into the wall directly beneath the east tower with 2 windows. Inside the little 20 by 12-foot room was a clutter-free desk, a few locked filing cabinets against the far wall, 6 chairs, and a few footlockers for emergency weapons and ammunition. The floorboards gave a creak at our entrance, but our entry went unnoticed by the men around the desk. Sitting behind the desk was John, and Ryan stood over him on the left, both looking intently at the 2 men across from them. The 2 men seated before John and Rhines were the strangers in the brown combat suits who brought in Michelle. Their wide hats were in their laps, and the 2 soldiers were sitting upright in a military fashion, they too not even noticing us as Carl and I took our places on John's side of the desk. Just as I rounded the desk, though, I caught sight of the little symbol on the 2 men's right shoulder guards. I knew I had recognized that armor before, as the little yellow and black symbol with the red star reminded me of the time I had seen it during an expedition towards some relay towers in the far southwest. These men were Rangers of the New California Republic. I couldn't think about this much more because my attention leaped into the conversation for me at the words. "Well, who would we be able to talk to about entry?" asked the Ranger on the right, the older one with the little tag above his right chest plate reading Banks. John stared at them with his eyebrows furrowed, saying without any emotion in his voice whatsoever, "That would be the constable. But he's busy." There was a short silence as the 2 Rangers looked to one another for a moment before adjusting in their seats. The younger one with the name tag reading Hale opened his mouth as if to respond when Ranger Banks instead broke the short silence. "I figured we would have earned some favor with you all for bringing the girl back." He paused, looking to each of us behind the desk before resuming. "Michelle's a fine girl, and it's really unfortunate what happened to her, but we didn't bring her back here because of how important she is. We just figured we had an obligation to help her. It's what we Rangers do, but we still have our orders and would like to work with you all." Rhines broke out with a small laugh at this, and Carl and I stayed serious like John while the 2 Rangers' expressions turned somewhat sour. "What's so funny?" asked the young Ranger with the Hale name tag on his armor. Although Rhines' laugh was short, the Rangers weren't alone in wondering what Rhines found so funny before he said, "Rangers have something of a reputation down in the Southwest. Obligations to help our people or the tribals down that way isn't something I thought I'd hear from NCR or Rangers today." I, too, was slightly familiar with some of the incidents down in that part of the wilderness regarding NCR Rangers and the prospectors who operated that way. Now, I hadn't had as much experience in that part of the wilderness as Rhines, John, or Lieutenant Young, but I believed their stories, so Rhines had a point. Still, the professionalism of the Rangers was admirable as they seemingly swallowed the shot at their organization's rep, and the older Ranger Banks replied simply, "We protect our citizens even in frontier lands." I'll just leave it at that before we go off on anything irrelevant to the matter at hand. Another silence ensued as we guardsmen looked sternly at the seated Rangers, while the Rangers looked equally as sternly at us. Neither Carl nor I knew what they were talking about before our arrival, but the Rangers apparently wanted entry to New Canaan, and were given the news that this request was out of the question for the time being. Perhaps I missed the part where the Rangers explained how they happened across Michelle, but their bringing Michelle back was truly appreciated by everyone who'd seen the state she was in when Carl and I brought her to the clinic. John Langdon must have been considering this as well, because he broke the silence by allowing the conversation to proceed. "Now I'm sure you understand the extent of your authority here, as you should understand that of Rhines and me. Nobody who can authorize the entry of men like yourselves is available at this time, and given your reputation, you're going to have to be a bit clearer with us. As much as we appreciate you returning that daughter of our community, I need something to tell the constable. Why are you even this far out here?" The whole tone of the room relaxed a bit as a sense of lingering frustration in the Ranger's demeanor remained. The older one motioned with his head to the younger Ranger Hale, before the latter answered. "We want to speak with the leader of your community. Discuss relations, as well as some other matters of diplomacy. That's all. That's also all we're authorized to give to someone not directly in charge of community relations." He paused before boldly going for broke. "How soon would we be able to get an audience with your Bishop Mordecai?" I don't think it was intentional, but that question made all of us guardsmen crack a smile, not intended to offend the Rangers. John explained this possible offense quickly by saying simply, "You don't. Outsiders don't just see or get an audience with Bishop Mordecai. The best you might be able to get is one with Constable Hanshaw. That said, I'm still going to need more details from you before I bother him about anything." Both Rangers sat back in their chairs before Ranger Banks shook his head in even more frustration. "Again, I'm afraid we're under instructions not to detail anything to anyone other than Mordecai, or in the worst circumstance, his direct subordinate, this apparent Constable Hanshaw you've been mentioning." Again, the tension in the air was detectable. Carl and I were still ignorant of all that was discussed before our entry, but Mr. Langdon and Rhines seemed entirely on top of things, as Rhines said more diplomatically than John. "We may be able to help, but don't expect to meet with him in the next few days. Constable is a busy man who happens to be pretty close to the family of the girl you brought in. We are all close with them, in fact, so I must thank you two once again for bringing Michelle back home. But now I have to ask, why did NCR send 2 Rangers this far into Utah to discuss relations as you say?" Frustrated silence stood in the air again before Rhines added, "Surely you can at least answer that." The Rangers both became more comfortable in their seats while their faces got even more serious. Almost with a scowl, and in a tone of near embarrassment despite the sternness on his face, Ranger Hale glanced to his partner before saying, "All we can say is that our orders, and who gave us them..." He paused. "Just believe me when I say it's a waste of both Banks and I's time. Also, believe it when I say we'd rather be with our brothers down in the Mojave, rather than running this errand." None of us guardsmen could decipher what was in the Rangers' minds, but their tone made us believe that they truly didn't want to be talking to us when their usual services had them fighting Legion and Raiders in and around the New Vegas area. With this general frustration at us, their situation revealed itself further when Ranger Hale added in traditional Californian fashion, "Perhaps there's a deal we can work out to expedite this whole thing?" Then it was John's turn to crack. "Ha! I was waiting for this question since I recognized that symbol on your shoulder plates. Maybe when you return to California or the Mojave, you can tell your merchants and your brothers in the service that we aren't the kind of people you can make underhanded deals with." The Rangers both bit their lips, and John concluded, "But you can humor me if you want." The Rangers looked to one another for another moment before briefly but meticulously scanning each of our faces, as if completely unaffected by any of the shots John and Rhines sent their way. The two each grinned as if they knew something about us that we didn't, and Ranger Banks said, "Get us an audience with Constable Hanshaw as soon as possible, and I'll tell you where we found Michelle. Down to the coordinates. We can even tell you what to look for. The guys who did it shouldn't be too far, but that was a week ago, and the winds can take tracks away if you don't act soon." John immediately looked to Carl and me. I thought I had it under control, but John focused on Carl and eyes faces for what felt like an incredibly uncomfortable amount of time. That offer of the Ranger must have made my face show what it had earlier when Carl and me were waiting outside the door to Michelle's room in the clinic. I think it was in this exchange of eye contact that he saw and felt what he and I felt when we learned the name of the young woman we brought to the clinic inside. I felt this because I myself started to internally hear the screams of Michelle once again. I think John, too, knew what Carl and I saw when Michelle was stripped and shown to be covered in so much dirt and blood before the sedative went into her arms. Normally, under any other circumstance, John, Rhines, Carl, or I would have laughed off an offer like the one Ranger Banks gave. However, as I mentioned, everyone in the Guard loved Michelle, loved Paul, and loved that family. That little offer and the reality of that timetable hit us all in a very strange way that rendered us all nearly speechless. This was especially so when I remembered the look on Paul's face when he stood frozen at who these 2 Rangers had brought in from the wasteland. "Vengeance is mine. I will repay," says the Lord. Maybe this isn't the correct way to view the word of God, but I feel that if the opportunity comes, we have a part to play in that vengeance as well. John turned back to the Rangers and said sternly as before, "Tell us everything about the attack and I'll make sure you speak to the constable as soon as possible." By the end of their account of how they found Michelle, I wanted nothing more than to go out immediately. The Rangers left soon afterward, allowing John, Rhines, Carl, and me to have a moment where we talked a few things over. It wasn't much, but after hearing what happened, we decided it was best to leave the details out for the rest of the detachment. But I did bring up how I thought William Ramos should know some of it, since I'd known he was close to or sweet on Sarah Parsons. John and Rhines both agreed to this, and John said that either he or Rhines would have a talk with him later. When all was said and done, the Rangers agreed to stay at the Trinity Inn until they could get their audience with the constable. John left the gate shack to head into town immediately after we decided to get back to our duty. It was really hard to wait out the rest of the shift after hearing about the scene they found Michelle had survived. I wasn't alone in thinking about everything the Rangers said. Carl, too, was mostly silent, and Rhines was as well. By the time we took our places outside the guard shack behind the barricade, the gate station was occupied by Barnett, Savitt, Ramos, and Parrish, who all seemed to understand the silence from me, Carl, and Rhines. The men left out of the loop were all aware of who the girl Carl and I brought inside was, and so there was nothing to say even as the Rangers disappeared into the crowd heading towards the Trinity Inn. As the minutes passed, John was still somewhere inside town, and Rhines eventually went off to check on the new guys, while the mood amongst the others gradually livened up. It never got to the point of cracking jokes or telling stories about this and that, but every now and then the odd question would come towards Carl and I like, what were those soldier types about? Carl explained they wouldn't tell us exactly after saying they were NCR Rangers, and the talk was short, near the end of the shift, and after a few quiet patrols of the market grounds. Ramos would ask me the occasional question here and there. I simply couldn't bring myself to even look at the boy, especially knowing who he liked and who was in Michelle's mission group. Still, the occasional question came my way, is Michelle going to be all right? And she went on mission with Sarah Parsons, right? Hope she's okay. All I could say in response to questions like that was we'll talk about it later. The minutes turned into hours, and the end of the shift was at hand. But still, there was nothing to talk about. What happened to Michelle? What happened to Sarah Parsons, the missionary Mr. Padilla, and their 2 escorts under her bane on their trek south about 3 weeks prior was not something I particularly care to write about at this time either. All I can say about the Rangers' account is that it was hard for me to stay the beacon of light and sole sense of humor amongst my friends in Paul's detachment after hearing it. I can also say that I believe what happened later was truly justified, but ultimately God will decide that, and I will get to what that looked like later. John returned to us just before the end of the shift, and rounded us all up before heading in with the guys at the other gate station. The replacements from the night guard took our spots, and even they were in a somber mood, even if they hadn't already heard what happened to the daughter of one of the guard's father figures. Anyway, John parted ways with the rest of us again after the gate shut behind the detachments of the day shift, but something told me he wasn't going home. It was on the short walk back to the barracks with the rest of the boys that we ran into Rhines and the new guys. Rhines dismissed them, and they joined Parrish, Savitt, and Barnett for the rest of the walk before catching Ramos and saying, "Do you mind if I have a chat with you?" I caught eyes with Rhines, and Carl did too, as we wordlessly told the squad leader that we should be there as well. Immediately, Rhines invited Carl and me to join the meeting. As the barracks were filled with the boys of the day shift going about their evenings, Rhines sat Ramos, Carl, and me down at one of the picnic tables outside. To keep it short, Rhines talked with our little brother in Paul's detachment, William Ramos, about what happened to Michelle and the party she was with. Avoiding the worst details, he had been informed that Sarah Parsons, Mr. Padilla of Missions Outreach, and their 2 escorts were no longer on this earth. The poor kid was just as broken by that news as I expected, and Carl and I both took the young man under our arms as he cried. Rhines was a great man, and he explained things to the kid as sympathetically as other fathers of the Guard, but I still found myself wondering why John wasn't the one giving the news. John was a lot closer to Ramos, Carl, and I, considering our time with him in the past 8 months. Again, Rhines was great too. But the fact that it was he who told Ramos what happened to his sweetheart left me wondering where John kept disappearing to since the meeting in the guard shack. Eventually, Carl and I both told Rhines that we got it from here, and Rhines departed from us slowly as the sky got darker, telling us he had to go inform Herbie what happened to his 2 men if he didn't already know. Normally, the barracks were a lively place at the end of the day shift. It wasn't uncommon for the guardsmen to kick or throw a ball around in the muster plaza long after the sky got dark and the street lamps came on. It also wasn't uncommon for the little fire pits to be surrounded by the day shift guards cooking an evening meal or just chatting away. This night was different. It was as if everyone in the whole guard community had known what happened to Paul's daughter, and knowing that Herben lost 2 men wouldn't help the matter if they didn't already know. Still, Carl and I sat with the boy as he slowly collected himself. By the time the streetlights came on, Ramos had asked us if we or the ranger knew who had attacked Michelle and Sarah's party, and we said we didn't. I mentioned it was probably any other gang of raiders out that way, and as I did so, I saw a flickering flame in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Just as I caught this, and before either me or Carl could say anything else, Doyle sat himself across from us at the outside table with a forlorn look in his eye. We asked if he heard what happened to Herbene's scouts on Mr. Padilla's escort, and he only nodded his head before saying he had heard it from the man himself. He explained that Herbene was very upset. The 2 scouts assigned to that escort job were 2 of his closest men. The news was even more devastating for Herbene since his scouts were taking a route they thought was safe. Doyle's peer and the scouts explained he hadn't even thought of them since setting out because he had so much faith in their safety. Ultimately, I concluded I would give Lieutenant Herbene my condolences personally the next time I saw him, and the 4 of us were left in silence for a long moment after Doyle was done talking, until the wind picked up and the silence of the barracks this night was interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming towards us. After a moment, all of us at the table turned, and there we saw 2 figures approaching us under the street lamps. I couldn't make either of them out under the shadows until they stepped into the light of the lamps around muster yard, and I didn't know what to even think. My body, and the body of everyone else at the table, only acted for us when John Langdon said with a scowl, "You boys hadn't turned in your weapons, I see." We all nodded, and I adjusted the sling of the Thompson submachine gun on my shoulder. Then, without thought, me, Carl, and Ramos all stood in unison, eyes full of determination, as Joshua Graham said, "Follow me." The 3 of us followed Joshua Graham, and John stood by just for a second to tell Doyle, "Lieutenant Doyle, find Herbene, gather 3 men, tell him to do the same, and meet us at the end of the West Road, southwest quadrant." A glance back showed Doyle nod and wordlessly carry out the instruction of the squad leader and his peers' detachment. John caught up with Graham and the rest of us in a moment, and we proceeded across the desolate streets of the town at night. Not a word was said, as Rhines came across our path and silently joined us as our boots rustled the cobblestone beneath us with each step. Eventually, the entire group stood at the end of the West Road, staring at the last row of houses, against the west wall beside a street lamp. We stood quietly for 10 minutes, and I looked at that house for a long time, until more footsteps from behind joined us. Joining us at the end of that street was Lieutenant Doyle, Hudson, Ray, Mr. Schmidt, Lieutenant Herbene, Bell, Clay, and Clyto. Every one of us had our duty weapons, rifles or automatics, and as the men of Herbene joined us, they each handed Carl, Ramos, and me a filled field pack before we walked towards that home illuminated by a single light. Graham, Rhines, and John approached the door to Paul's home, and the latter thrusted a field pack into the arms of the deadened silhouette of my lieutenant. Doyle unslung an extra machine pistol off his shoulder, and Paul disappeared into his home for about a minute and a half before re-emerging into the night in the uniform of the guard, pack on his back and weapon in hand. Paul stormed past the rest of us without a word, followed close behind by Graham, John, and Rhines, while the rest of us joined them all on the silent march toward the gate. While we were waiting for the members of the night guard to lower the gate, Rhines turned to John, Paul, and Graham at the head of the caravan, removed the magazines of ammo from his duty vest, and handed them to Graham before saying just loud enough for a few to hear, "I'll do it. I'll stay behind and speak to the constable. Make sure you use this ammo." Rhines departed our group with a look of determination on his face as John nodded in acknowledgement and approval of Rhines's decision. Just as the gates began to creak open in the dead of night, all 14 of us in this posse of guardsmen stood eyes forward, ready to set out. When we entered the sparsely populated market grounds at this time of night, I heard something spoken by a few wasters huddling around a fire that made me take another long look at the one leading us and Paul out into the wastes. Chapter 27. It Was You. The next morning. Narrative continued by Deacon Saul Mathers. Looking into her calm face, I couldn't help feeling what I felt. Between those bruises, scratches, swollen eye, and dried tears, I thought of what could have possibly reduced her to that horrible state. Her arm began to twitch, and her breathing slowly became more rapid. I was warned about this kind of thing, so I gripped her arm delicately, wiped the unwanted tear from my eye, and watched her breathing slow back to its normal rhythm as I gently rubbed her wrist with my thumb, stuck in thought about this poor girl and the girl I met. "How you feel, Ranger?" said the 30-something man in the black police equipment. His black pants and vest were still covered in dirt as he lorded over the cot. I took a quick look at my surroundings, appearing to be in a hospital. The place was really a shack. The only evidence it was a hospital was the padded cot I was on, the surgical tray on the nightstand, and the thin white dividers around me I'd seen in ruined hospitals back in California. Looking back at my interrogator, I was pretty sure this one's name was Paul, but I couldn't say for sure since most of the new Canaanite soldiers who found me looked similar under their caps. He must have waited long enough for an answer because when I met his face again, he asked, "Well, your voice give out now?" Despite the question and its tone, he apparently wasn't angry. None of the new Canaanites who found me were angry, even when they found me where I was. He asked this sounding much more frustrated, or like he was being forced to show compassion to me. I understood if all their kindness towards me since meeting them was forced. He looked as though he was going to say something else or just walk out when I found my voice. "Where am I?" He tensed up a bit, and those lines between his stern eyes got deeper before he said, "You're in a hospital. Or clinic. Dr. Franklin just set this place up recently to treat outsiders like you beyond the wall." He stopped at this, and he stood staring at me like a frustrated statue for a long moment afterward. I could still see the "how you feeling?" on his face. The way he looked at me was almost like he just needed me to answer that question before he could rid himself of my presence. Thinking of that question, I still hurt from so many burns, so many hits, and seeing him stand there made me think once more about all that happened. "Look, I'm sorry. I didn't know what to add as I couldn't think of anything other than the events leading up to this rescue." Paul raised his eyebrow at my loss of words, and all I could think about was the loss of my men. The death-stricken faces of Sam, Walton, and Dwayne flashed before me. There was so much blood. The four of us killed them all, and I would have happily done so again and again if it didn't kill us too. I looked at my judge again and told him straight and full of pain, "I'm sorry you and your men were close to those people, but they..." His face began to show anger like it was an emotion he only brought out for special occasions. Despite this, I said, Who attacked who doesn't matter. We got them and they certainly got us too, so be assured by that if nothing else." The rage on his face was cooled, returned to that stern judgment, and I paid him no more mind as I thought of all those my friends and I killed, how that in turn killed my friends and put me where I presently was. The deaths of my rangers must have flashed in my mind 100 more times before my eyes returned to Paul, who sternly demanded an answer from me. "Do you believe in God?" "Which one?" I asked, automatically and instantly. I heard from all my work in the Utah wilderness over the past year that new Canaanites were religious people. I also knew of gods and many gods from time with the tribes across the Sonoran and later California wastes. I heard about Ubology from folks who lived in San Fran too, but in the end, my entire familiarity with God, or gods in general, was not something I ever believed I had time to even think about. Either way, Paul, the new Canaan soldier, didn't answer. My question merely made him scoff before he said plainly, "About what I expected. After what you and your men did, I'd say you should meet him. You might figure out why you ended up the way you did." He stopped at the sound of footsteps just outside the cubicle we occupied. This brief pause was just loud enough for me to wince at the pain from so many injuries and think about how I already knew how I ended up like this. I saw the faces of those I ended, those I failed to end, and those whom I let down, all hovering in the back of my mind before the moment of silence ended and two women appeared in the entryway. "There you are, Paul. How long have you been in here? Have you turned in your equipment yet?" asked the woman around Paul and my age as she stepped further into the patient cubicle. The long brownish-red hair of the woman was the cleanest I'd seen anywhere else in the wasteland. Her eyes were greener than green, and her blue and white striped dress made it look as though we were transported to a world before the nuclear war. But what really caught my attention was her belly. Evidently very much pregnant, she looked as though she was only a couple weeks or maybe even days from popping, as she entered the cubicle and kissed Paul, the new Canaanite, on the cheek. Following the woman into the confined little space was what I could only describe as the woman's little twin. Hiding behind her mom and holding the end of the long dress, A little girl around the age of 10 with those same green eyes, that same hair, and even that same style dress, followed her mother into the room and looked at me curiously as she entered. Paul could clearly not see the girl from where his wife stood, and upon making eyes with me, the little girl made a shush motion when she brought her finger to her mouth. I turned my attention back to the face of Paul at the sound of the wife's kiss landing on his cheek, and saw just how much his entire demeanor had changed. No longer was he scowling, angry, or frustrated. In fact, it was hard to describe him at all as he returned a kiss to his wife's cheek, and subtly rubbed the mark on his face as he answered the woman. I was going to head home as soon as I got this wounded man situated and returned my equipment. The constable said I could have the rest of the day off when we got back, and you know I can't stay away from you or the girls, honey. The woman's face reddened as she placed her hands on her belly and looked down, saying sweetly, "I know. I just missed you. I heard you got back a half an hour ago from John and the others. I just thought or we'd surprise you." Just then, the little girl came out from behind her mother's dress with a leap. "Hi, Daddy." Immediately, Paul's face lit up as he picked up the girl with a big hug. "There she is. How did you grow so much in 2 little weeks? You're getting too big for me to do this, but my, you look so pretty today, Michelle. You have fun with Mom and your baby sister while I was gone." In his elation, his eyes went to me, the stranger, and he instantly set the little Michelle down. He straightened his demeanor, and his wife's green eyes instantly flashed to me as he started, "We'll have to take this out." His wife, however, wouldn't have it as my still troubled eyes met her bright green eyes, and she said immediately, "How rude of me, I'm so sorry. I'm Daniela, but most call me Danny. How are you, sir? I'm so happy my husband found you. I hope you aren't too badly hurt." Paul seemingly wanted to warn her off, but couldn't as she instantly approached my bedside, asking my name with an extended hand. I instinctively took her hand, saying through her eyes in my bodily pain, "My name's Mathers. Good to meet you too, ma'am." She shook my hand and said how I was in good hands as I used all of my effort to stifle a scream that came from the pain that the handshake gesture riled. Right in the site where the tomahawk punctured my armor just below my right arm, I fought the pain and almost couldn't hear her anymore. On top of this, I found myself somewhat lost as she spoke in a tone far different from those of the guardsmen who reluctantly took me back to their home for recovery. Still, that smile persisted on her face as she spoke on, and I was just so lost in this cheery greeting as her smile and pleasantries began to tear away the problems in the back of my mind. When she released my hand, oblivious to the pain I was enduring, I remember thinking that I would have extended my hand again if I could do it all over just for that little bit of kindness. Either way, I used the rest of my effort to compose myself as she backed up, and the words she'd been saying to me went back to her husband seamlessly as she turned to him. "So if you could please do that for me, I'd really appreciate it, honey. I got to run before Mrs. So-and-so runs out of that cloth my women's group needs. Just promise you'll be home as soon as you can. Hannah's needing a lot of attention, but try to have a little fun with Michelle, too. She's missed you every day these past 2 weeks. Anyway, I won't be long, and I'll see if Jessica can watch the kids for a bit this evening, too, so we can have some alone time." Paul stuttered, trying to get a word in, but Daniela, his wife, turned to the little girl and went right along. "You, Missy, are going to stay with Daddy for the rest of the afternoon. Would you like that, sweetie?" "Yes, Mom," shouted the little girl ecstatically, as Paul continued to try to get a word in. "Thanks so much, honey. No more than 45 minutes, I swear. Hope you get well soon, Mr. Mathers. We should have you over for dinner sometime." Her words trailed off as she exited the cubicle, and in a moment, we heard the door to the clinic open in the distance as the words Paul had for his wife trailed off as well. "I can't look after her right now. I need to—" But Daniela was already off to her errand in the market, leaving me in the cubicle with my stern interrogator from earlier and a pretty little green-eyed girl. The girl stared at me, and Paul collected himself for a moment after his wife's departure. After a moment, he knelt down, whispered something to the little girl, and she went to go stand in the corner of the cubicle as Paul tried his best to regain his tone and intimidating appearance from earlier. This physical resetting of his composure in the moments after Daniela left would have been pretty funny, and something I would have pointed out if it wasn't for the lingering pain in nearly all of my extremities. Thinking of this pain made those memories of all that happened out there in the wilderness begin to resurface, and it didn't help when Paul finally collected himself enough to say to me, "I'm sorry for the interruption," and I only thought the words, Don't be as I saw the little girl's eyes go from me to her dad over in that corner. Again, he fixed his countenance, and my attempts at fending off the haunting of those memories were put to the test even further when he said, "Well, as I was saying earlier, you think about how you ended up in this state, and what happened to your rangers while you rest up. We'll make sure you get fixed up, but don't expect to stay. The other guardsmen are already arranging transport to get you back to your homeland or as far away from us as possible." A single second of silence ensued after the last word left his lips, and I knew my fate. As kind as it was for he and his men to get me to a doctor in the first place, a large part of me wished they would have just finished me off out in the wastes. Hearing my fate, the image of that long walk back to Broken Hills, to New Reno, then to NCR made me feel like crying for the first time in as long as I could remember. What would that walk be like? I didn't know exactly, but I did know that every step of those 200 miles would be with those haunting faces glaring at me, asking the same question I was asking myself when I looked at Paul's, "Why didn't you die like your men? Like those people you killed?" In just a flash, the image of all that shame, all that guilt, the images of how I might take my own life after a shameful return to my brothers in the Rangers, vanished with the first sound I heard. Just like when Daniela came in with her little twin, the future I knew I deserved was gone when the little Michelle shouted from that corner, "Don't be mean, Daddy!" Paul's face twisted through every emotion imaginable at the sound of her voice before landing on confusion as he watched his little daughter run straight to my bedside. I felt the little hand place itself on my arm, and my eyes went between the speechless confusion or frustration on Paul's face to the bright, smiling face of that little girl beside me. Her hand still on my arm, she dropped herself onto her knees at my bed and glanced back at her dad, saying in that sing-song voice, "Do it like this, Daddy." Her face turned back to mine, and she said straight to me, "Do you know who Jesus is, mister?" I looked from her smile to Paul, who still couldn't seem to find anything to say before I looked back to her and said the first thing that came to mind. "No, I can't say I really do. Who's that?" Paul still stood like a statue that seemingly wanted to tell his daughter to get away from the stranger but couldn't. I too felt the need to apologize to Paul about speaking to his daughter without his permission, but also couldn't. I saw the faces again begin to take shape in my mind during the brief moment after I answered. Once more those images or scenes from so much killing and death, friends and enemies, across the Arizona, Mojave, California, and Utah wastelands beginning to play in my mind. Again, the regrets and failures of the life I lived in memory were battered into nothing when that smiling little girl at my bedside started speaking like the child she was, full of sincerity and innocence. "He's my best friend. You can meet him too. I talk to him all the time and he takes care of me. He can be your best friend too. I'm going to tell him all about you because you seem kind, and you look like you want a friend. Do you want a friend, mister?" The mere fact she was talking to me, despite the fact she didn't know who I was, what I'd done, who I let down, or who I hurt, meant far more than I could express, even if I was able. Perhaps she wouldn't have been so friendly and loving towards me, a stranger, if she knew what her dad knew about me. But for the moment that didn't matter. Paul still could not seem to say anything, or enlighten his daughter about what I'd done to her community's friends. I felt my eyes get clouded and wet as she spoke to me about her friend Jesus, and those haunting memories were kept at bay as her question entered my mind. "Do you want a friend, mister?" Did I want a friend? I didn't have any friends anymore. Not more than a week ago, I lost all my friends. I got them killed. Walton, Sam, and Dwayne's faces hovered behind the girl's smiling face. But they weren't as tragic to look at as they were less than a minute ago, and I didn't know why, despite the crushing weight of emotions I couldn't identify pressing down on my heart. I could only nod at the question as I wiped my eyes in a gesture that again brought more pain to the sight of my injuries. Seeing her clearly, the care and concern on her face was not her own. It knew me even if I didn't know myself, because the sympathy in that face turned once again to joy, and she went right along. "I can be your friend too. So can my daddy. Daddy tells me all about Jesus, just like my teacher. My daddy can be very kind too. He does a lot of things Jesus does, but sometimes my dad can be mean. I love my daddy and mama, and my teacher is so nice. In school we learned all about when Jesus talked to the Canaanite woman, and..." The girl went on and on and on, talking to me about her family, and about all the things a child could tell you about Jesus without stopping and without any more questions. Her voice was the sweetest thing a man who lived nearly his whole life in the violent wastes could hear. For over 5 minutes, Paul's little girl, Michelle, sat by my bedside, smiling at me the whole time, telling me all she was capable of telling me about Jesus Christ and everything her young life held dear, and at no point did I ever want her to stop smiling at or talking to me. The longer she talked, the more I saw her innocent smile. The longer those painful memories of recent or distant past would stay away from the forefront of my mind. She continued to talk to me, and I wouldn't have had it any other way as the faces of my rangers faded away to be replaced by the world around me, and that smiling girl. As she continued giving me her kindness, I'd occasionally catch glimpses of Paul over her shoulder. Where he originally looked to be gathering the ability to tell his daughter to back away, by the end, Paul's own face showed a smile to match Michelle's or Daniela's. Even if his smile looked as though part of it was rooted in embarrassment for his daughter's freeness of expression. In the end, I didn't want her to ever stop talking to me about her friend Jesus and all the other things she loved. But after several minutes, Paul finally managed to speak. Michelle. She stopped and turned to her dad. Michelle, why don't we let Mr. Mathers get some sleep for a while? He's still in a lot of pain. She looked back to me, and even though Paul could hear because of how small the cubicle was, she whispered to me, I'll ask Mama and Daddy to pray for you tonight. Then she winked at me in a way that said she hadn't quite mastered that simple ability and leaped up to run to her dad's side saying, Okay, Daddy. Having heard what his daughter whispered to me, he was still smiling and shaking his head when she threw her arms around his waist. Just then he collected himself again and freed himself from her grip before squatting down to her level and telling her, Sweetie, why don't you go wait in the lobby? I'll be there in a minute. She looked towards me with a worried look on her face before Paul added, Do that and I'll get you whatever candy you want at the general store on the way home. Immediately the girl's face lit up and she walked hurriedly out to the clinic waiting area with a thank you, Daddy, and I was left with Paul alone. For a moment, as Paul again gathered his composure, I feared the return of those memories while I waited for the stern countenance of Paul to take over his face once again. As the silence lasted for another few moments longer, I realized that the only thing I could think of was the women in Paul's life that gave him so much joy. I thought of his wonderfully pregnant, friendly wife, and the smile of his brave daughter ready to tell complete strangers all about what she loves. For a moment, I found myself thinking, I want a family like that. But then, as the silent seconds passed, and that embarrassed smile persisted on Paul's face, I found myself thinking something even more as the words of that little girl rang in my mind, still keeping the haunting memories at bay. I want what made that little girl so happy. I want what could change Paul from a bitter interrogator to that smiling man across from me who can't regain his authority for the life of him. Paul finally regained himself enough after Michelle's departure, looked to me with an embarrassed air about him, and said as a sort of blush appeared on the parts of his cheeks not smeared by wasteland dust, Sorry about my girl. I finally found it in myself to utter what I couldn't earlier. Don't be. He seemingly ignored this, looking more at the ground than me as he added, You know how kids can be, they can really chat your ear off. I didn't say anything, merely stuck in thought, thinking about everything that little girl spent 5 straight minutes telling me about, those memories still not daring to show themselves again, even as Paul concluded everything he had left for me since I awoke. I'll let you rest up a while. Either me or John or one of the others will check up on you before the day's out. Just focus on healing up for now. And I know it was a lot, but think about what my girl was telling you. Even that last part, he said, concealing a smile as he still refused to look at me. I did indeed intend to think about that, and without anything else, Paul left my cubicle, but he hadn't even disappeared from the opening before I heard him say full of joy, Michelle? What are you doing out here, Trouble? I thought I told you to wait in the lobby, you spying on us, sweetie? The little girl replied without shame beyond the divider. Sorry, Daddy, but yes. Paul walked his daughter towards the door, and the door soon shut behind them, but not before I heard him say, I got to check in with Grandpa Hunshaw, but we'll get you that candy on the way home. And that was that. The memories of my life would, of course, resurface again even later that day, but I found it easier to subdue them when I thought of that little girl's smile, and how she turned Paul into something unknown to those like me he found in the wasteland. For a long time, I thought a family, a wife, a daughter like that would be able to turn me from something I didn't like, having to be out in the wasteland. But eventually, I got to thinking more into it. What was it that made that girl brave enough to approach a killer, a gunman, a ranger like me, even if she didn't know I was so bad? Childish innocence, sure, perhaps in part, but that wasn't it. My teams and I had found all kinds of children, all kinds of wives and women out in the wastes, but none like that. As the days passed and my recovery went on, I began to think less of how that family treated me, and more about what was said. I thought of what made that girl so eager to talk to me about, and how that action alone helped me in ways beyond description after the encounter that landed me in the company of New Canaanites. For me, the answer came in the form of that little girl's best friend, the one who could change a hardened man like Paul at sight of his daughter's mention of him. The one who spared me, the one who saved me, who landed me in that company, that clinic, and who had so much more planned for me when I was ready to give up. The one who could be my best friend too, if I heeded the message of a 10-year-old girl. Jesus Christ. I cannot say that I was converted outright by a little girl who spoke to me for 5 minutes straight. But what she did, what Paul's wife did, and how they affected Paul himself, was the spark. I never left New Canaan. I was never put on that caravan back west. Paul and the rest of the guard never sent me on my way. I was welcomed, slowly, and sometimes hesitantly amongst those who knew what I did. But the more I recovered, and the longer I stayed, the more I learned about who Michelle first told me about. For many days, many nights, many weeks, I heard more about him, I helped where I could, and my past was left in the past before I entered the community and became part of it. I've served in the Temple sect for over 5 years at this point, and whenever I think back to what started that fire I have in my heart for Christ my Lord, I always end up thinking of that little girl smiling at me when nobody had any reason to smile at me at all. It was her. It was her childlike kindness that introduced me to what his kindness is like, what kindness I needed right in that moment at the clinic, what kindness I by no means deserved. It was her who created that spark on his behalf, that made me seek him in all my waking hours, and led me to this life I was living, and the life I loved so much. And it was her who was torn apart by that world out there. With a mind returned fresh from those recollections of my first time meeting Paul and his wonderful daughter, I could only wipe the tear from my eye and whisper to that calm, bruised face of the present day, "It was you, sweetheart. It was you who introduced me to him, and I can't thank you enough if I tried. He got me through so much. He'll get you through this too. I promise." I continued to rub her wrist with my thumb, and then she awoke. The eye of Michelle fluttered open through the swelling around her eyelid. She turned her face to me as I put my hand back on the bed, and after studying me for a few short seconds, she began to cry silently. I couldn't help but hold her wrist again, as her sobbing became vocal by winded exhales, and she stared at the ceiling while the tears flowed down her cheeks. "It's all right, Michelle. It's okay," I said, as controlled and soothingly as I was able. Her sobbing increased as she hyperventilated and asked between short breaths, "Where's Mom? Where is she? Where's my mom? Where's Dad?" I held her arm with both hands as she repeated this a few more times and told her calmly, "It's okay, sweetheart. Your mom just stepped out to get you some breakfast. She'll be back real soon, I promise. Don't worry. You're safe." This assurance seemed to calm her down. Her breath slowed to a rhythmic pace, but still, the tears flowed as the quiet seconds passed, and the light of morning peered through the blinds beyond her tragic frame. As she collected herself, she'd regained control of her breathing, and I reached for the handkerchief in my tunic to wipe her eyes when she asked more collected now, "Where's Dad?" She waited for my answer, but I was still unable to speak as I watched one particular tear come to a halt at the edge of her bruised cheek. It eventually fell as another one took its place along the same stream before I told her, "You know, I'm actually looking for him myself. Your mom might know. We didn't have time to talk before she left to get your breakfast." This was true, and telling her this seemed to work as the flow of tears stopped and I offered her my handkerchief. She took it with a trembling hand, still staring into that ceiling and seeming to do her best at containing her inner struggles. Just as she handed me the cloth back, the door handle behind me gave a click and I told the young woman, "Sounds like she's back. Don't worry anymore." As I stood from the stool, I caught a few more tears flow down her calm face before turning and seeing Daniela enter the room with a tray full of food in both hands. I gestured towards the stool, and the woman of today was another tragic comparison to the woman I met all those years ago. Daniela gave me a silent nod of thanks to my offering of the seat beside her daughter, still seeming to hold back her own tears as she sat down and rolled the surgical table over for something to hold the tray. Still a very pretty woman, Daniela sat down beside her daughter, her little twin, eyes fixed on the girl, and that little nod of thanks repeated in my mind. Those green eyes were dulled and sunken by grief, her shoulders lowered and her hair disheveled by sleeplessness and worry, and yet she was still so pretty, even through all the worry she'd gone through since her daughter's unexpected and tragic arrival from the wastes. The tears returned to mark the cheeks of Michelle, and Daniela perched herself right by the bedside to hold her daughter's arm until I said aloud and unconsciously, "That's a lot of good food there, Michelle. It'll definitely do you some good to eat something." Michelle remained unmoving, but this utterance seemed to remind Danny of something she'd forgotten upon seeing her daughter awake again. Danny moved the tray closer, picked a few bites of the oats, and collected a small portion of bread as she sat on the bedside and said to Michelle, "Mr. Mathers is right, sweetie. Some food will help you." The two were silent as Daniela fed her daughter and herself, and there I stood, almost blank in mind as I could only watch the care Daniela was giving Michelle. After both had taken a few bites, Danny turned to me from that bedside, tears trickling down her face as she mouthed the words, "Thank you," to me. I merely nodded, and there she began to feed her daughter again for another few moments of silence. At last, the two had eaten their fill as the surgical table was pushed away and Danny returned to the stool beside Michelle. If their physical states didn't say it already, the amount they'd eaten from the tray did. What was probably enough food on that tray to feed 4 people looked as though it was only a few small birds that had picked at it. Then silence reigned again, as Danny's entire attention was locked on her daughter. The steadiness of Michelle's breathing indicated she was calm, if not ready to sleep again. It was in this silence that I came to find the reason I was here in the first place once again. A question that Michelle wanted to know as well, and so I sought the answer before Michelle could return to the healing land of sleep once more. "Danny, if I may ask, do you know where I can find Paul?" Michelle was asking about him as well. I asked in my most timid voice. Danny turned in her chair towards me, her pretty face looking even more sunken than before, as she released a long breath and told me in a way that said she didn't have time to be upset or sad about her husband as well. "I don't know, Mr. Mathers, I'm sorry. He said he was going for a walk last night, but I haven't seen him since..." Just then, Michelle began to softly weep again, and Danny turned right back around to calm her down. It troubled me deeply that Paul had disappeared in the immediate wake of what happened to his daughter. I know he was with Danny and Michelle in this room all afternoon and all evening yesterday. But to go for a walk and not return to his daughter's bedside first thing in the morning was not something I would have ever expected from Paul. I thought of Danny's face before she turned back to Michelle, and knew that she would love to cry and worry about where Paul went off to, but she needed to save all her feelings for the girl on the hospital bed. This attitude in Danny was very admirable, but it made me sad for their children, and wonder where Paul could have gone. Danny must have sensed that second part because as she calmed her daughter back down, she said with her back to me, "The kids are staying with Constable Henshaw and Leslie." She glanced over her shoulder at me and added, "Could you go find the constable and ask if he's seen Paul? We'd appreciate it." Stuck in thought, I replied, "I was thinking I'd do just that." Still facing her daughter, Danny kissed her daughter's arm and held it tighter as she said, "Thank you, Mr. Mathers," and then I departed. I left Michelle's room in Dr. Stepp's clinic, passing a few nurses in the hall who greeted me by my title and exited wordlessly into the streets in the cool morning. Zipping up my jacket further, my feet planted on the cobblestone of the town square, looking over the fountain as people passed on their way to their occupations, and a line of children on my left crossed the square toward the schoolhouse. It was just a little before 7 a.m., and I was still wondering how Paul could disappear when his family needed him. Such a thing was again so unlike him, especially after hearing he'd been by his wife and Michelle's side every second, following Michelle's unfortunate return. It was really hard to not think about my friend, or his daughter's condition, and although I wasn't sent to find Paul as part of my duties for the temple, I certainly wanted to find him as a friend. The whole reason I was looking for Paul in the first place was because I cared for him and wanted to check in with him, see how he was doing, and minister to him on a personal level before I had to check in at the temple by 11. Hearing about Michelle's early return from mission and the condition she arrived in through my colleagues in the Deacon housing block put him and his family at the forefront of my mind. Seeing her state on that hospital bed and the state of Danny left me wondering even more about what happened to Michelle, while also affirming that Paul was in need of a friend to give him some ministry. If only he hadn't disappeared. I'd been standing in front of the clinic for long enough and figured he might have gone about his duties earlier, or before his wife woke up to get his mind off of things. That had to be it, I figured, but I still didn't know where his duties took him on that particular day. So I decided I'd seek out the constable, who should have been in his office at the barracks around this time. I recognized this particular guardsman from my assistance in he and his wife's counseling sessions, a man who I knew who could save me a trip to the barracks and meeting with the constable, a man who was in Paul's detachment. "Mr. Rhines, how are you? It's been a while. How are you and Melanie?" The guardsman stopped, looked at the door to the clinic only a few feet away, and then looked around for who spoke until his eyes landed on me. The last of the people on this side of the town square were disappearing into their work establishments, and the confused look on Ryan's face turned into joy at sight of me, while his eyes said he had other matters on the brain. "Ah, Mr. Mathers, I'm well. So's Melanie. How about yourself?" said Rhines as I approached his side under the clinic sign. His eyes went back to the clinic door briefly as I stepped up, saying, "I too am doing all right. Now I can tell you're busy, so I'll be quick about it." "Go ahead, Deacon," said the man with a polite nod. "I'm looking for the constable, but just wanted to ask where he usually is this time of day. I don't want to go running all over town." The man forced a smile, again looking at the clinic door before returning to me and saying, "Sure thing, I could tell you, but honestly." He paused and glanced up at the sign. "But what, Mr. Rhines?" He looked at me and let out a collective breath. "It's nothing. I was just going to say you should avoid the constable. He just got a lot dumped on his plate this morning. Perhaps you could wait and seek him out later." "What's it about, if you don't mind my asking?" I wondered what was dumped on the constable's plate this morning to cause the constable such distress. However, since Rhines was in Paul's detachment, I knew I could be honest. "I'm sorry to hear about the constable, but I was only looking for him in order to seek out Paul. Perhaps I can skip that part with Hanshaw if you know where your lieutenant is." Rhines looked even more uneasy at this mention, and then his eyes went back to the clinic door. "You just came from the clinic, right?" I nodded. He nodded in understanding and went on. "Thought so. You visit with Danny and Michelle?" Again, I nodded. "I was looking for Paul. Thought he'd be with Michelle. I'm just looking to minister to my friend. What happened to his daughter was..." His expression felt a sadness and something else. "I don't know what happened to his daughter exactly, but I know Paul could use some spiritual help. A simple friend." The man began to look even more uneasy as his gaze left me and went to the town square. Very few people were walking the streets now, and with a glance at me he was about to say something, but seemingly couldn't. "What aren't you telling me, Mr. Rhines?" I asked in all humility. With a gesture of his head, he told me to come closer, and I did. He said in the same tone he'd been using this whole exchange, but very lowly he went out. Him, John, Doyle, and Herbin took a bunch of the guys out to find the ones who attacked Michelle and her mission party. He must have seen the look on my face because he added instantly, "Don't tell anyone and don't judge any of them." My mouth interrupted for me at that last part. I couldn't possibly judge them. I saw the condition of Michelle. He looked at me somewhat perplexed. "Didn't know there were any like you in the temple sect, but thank you. I only stayed behind to explain things to the constable, and I just came from doing so. That's why he isn't a place to be talked to. I think it's best to let Hanshaw cool off. He'll understand. Heck, if the party wasn't headed by Graham, I'm pretty sure he would have given the go-ahead anyway." He paused, and I couldn't help blurting out in astonishment, "What? Graham's out there leading them?" At the time, I wasn't aware of Graham's orders to be confined within the walls of town. I was merely shocked that Paul and the group out there seeking retribution for Michelle were headed by Graham. This was a lot to take in, and Rhines must have seen this on my expression because he said, "Yeah, but if you'll forgive me, I'll have to leave it at that for now." He paused, seeing me still stuck in thought before glancing at the clinic door again. "I gotta tell Paul's wife where he went. Not to mention the wife of John, Doyle, and some of the others in that posse." I was still frozen. and Rhines was about to depart before I stopped him one last time. Something told me Rhines knew everything going on, what happened to Michelle and her party. Facing me and moving towards the clinic door, he answered, "If you got the time, go talk to the Rangers about it. Some NCR Rangers were the ones who brought her in yesterday, so you'll have to talk to them if you can. Get past the fact they're secular Rangers. They're staying at the Trinity Inn outside the gates. I'm sorry, Deacon, but I have to go." At that, he turned, and the bell to the door of Dr. Stepp's clinic rang as he exited my company. There was a lot on my mind when I turned back to the open town square. The place was desolate. My watch beeped, indicating it was officially 7 a.m., and I wouldn't be able to find Paul. He and many others from the guard had departed into the wastes last night. I had assumed that this departure in the night wasn't authorized by their commander when I thought of Rhines's face as he told me the situation, and said how Hanshaw was not in a mood to be spoken to. The one thing I wanted to do, minister to my friend in need, couldn't be done, and all I could do was think about the tragic faces of his daughter and wife as I looked out at the vacant square. Michelle's face would haunt me as the seconds passed, and I got to thinking about Graham, the man who was leading a posse of New Canaan's most experienced guardsmen. As I imagined what they were doing, I got to thinking, what could make Paul follow a man like Graham, redeemed or not, into the wastes and track down the ones who put his daughter in that state? Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And I began to wonder what that would look like as I wondered how I'd be able to minister to Paul when he returned, and remembered Michelle's tears on that hospital bed. I thought of what Rhines had said, and who brought Michelle back home from the wastes. Mr. Rhines was evidently one of those who didn't know about my past, based on what he said about the Rangers, and I continued thinking about this even as I soon found my legs carrying me toward the gates to the market. Perhaps it wasn't my business, but I had to know what happened to Michelle and set Paul off into the wastes. The way I saw it, I could only effectively minister to Paul if I knew more about the situation, but little did I know there was something else that made me leave the confines of town that morning. I struggled to figure out what that other thing was, but Rhine's referral rang in the back of my mind all the while. Making my way through the busy morning crowds of the market, my nose was filled with the smoke of barrel fires beneath the overcast sky. Fighting the cold breeze, I looked down the south road, past the incoming or outgoing trains of travelers and mules, looking out at the distant refugee village that occupied most of my time when I wasn't attending meetings in the temple, and decided to turn. I realized what that other thing drawing me this morning was when I opened the door to the Trinity Inn, scanned the crowds of wasteland travelers escaping the outside cold, and found them sitting at a little table by the window. Maneuvering around the crowds packed around each table, I found myself standing before two NCR Rangers, sitting opposite one another by that window. The morning light from outside peered through the glass, showing them both in brown pants, cowboy boots, tan shirts, both with belts holding ammo pouches and canteens, and each wearing leather satchels while short-range radio receivers sat clipped to their breast pockets. I studied the black steel revolvers with the redwood grips and golden bear insignia sticking out of the holsters at their hips before my eyes drifted to the two men's faces. I saw both sat staring at me from behind scratched aviator sunglasses with bright smiles on their faces before the older one on my right said straight to me, "Can we help you, Padre?" Both of them remained smiling at me in a very amused sort of way as 1,000 memories with men like these from my earlier life hit me in a millisecond. I shook the memories out of my head, saying, "Yes. Hello, gentlemen. How are you this morning?" "We're doing great, Padre. There's something we can do for you?" Hearing the word Padre again made me wonder what could have made them say that. I was only wearing my black jacket, slacks, and shoes. Perhaps they could see the white shirt peeking out from under my jacket, but still. Padre? Suddenly I felt their eyes scanning me from behind those shades, and knew that they were looking at the smooth surface of my slacks and the shine in my shoes. I looked and carried myself unlike any of the other 100 people in this establishment. All I said in response was, "If you men have the time, I'd like to speak with you for a moment." "Sure thing. Take a seat, please," said the younger one on my left. The young ranger stood and pushed the passed-out man at the table next to us to the ground in a single motion, moving the chair to his spot, while taking his own chair to sit beside the older ranger. I looked to the passed-out man who hadn't woken up, even by his sudden relocation to the ground, and sat myself down at the ranger's table with the timid words, "Thank you." I was going to say something else, but I glanced back down at the unconscious waster on the floor before the younger ranger with a name tag above his right breast pocket, reading Hale, spoke once again. "Don't mind him, Padre. He'll be all right. He was hitting the bottle pretty hard at that table last night after Martha and her boys closed for the night. Doubt he even felt it." With a smile, he added, "Not a bad idea, come to think of it, in reference to something I didn't quite get at the moment." Looking back at the two rangers, they both moved back an inch in their chairs and removed their sunglasses, since the light outside wasn't as bright anymore. Still, they both looked at me with pleasant grins from across the table, and the noise around us faded into the distance as the older one with the name tag reading Banks said, "So, what you want to chat with us about, Padre?" I smiled back, trying to recall exactly what I myself wanted to talk to them about as I answered. "Please, call me Mr. Mathers. I'm a deacon with the temple." The younger ranger Hale jutted in politely. "No offense, Padre, but if you're here to tell us about Jesus, we'll tell you what we told the fella last night. We'll think about it." The older gave his comrade a sharp nudge and amusingly told his partner, "Call him Mr. Mathers, Hale. Show some respect." I said in my most sympathetic or diplomatic tone, no offense taken, recalling other memories of my past where rangers acted just like these two in the towns of the Sonoran and California wastes, diplomatic but with a will unchanging. The younger sat back in his chair, still relaxed and grinning, while the older said, "Still, my part is right. We already heard it from Pastor, Deacon." Turning to his partner, "What was that guy's name again?" "You think I remember?" said the younger, before both Banks and Hale exclaimed at the exact same time. "Pastor Rudy, that's what it was." The two chuckled for a moment. I couldn't help but join in. After a second, Ranger Banks said to me, "Still, we already heard about salvation, so is there something else we could do for you, Mr. Mathers? Even just being around these men reminded me of so many good times during my life with the desert, and then NCR Rangers, that I almost forgot there ever were bad times." As I said, "No, I'm not here to talk to you about Jesus Christ, at least not now." I couldn't help but smile a bit wider, and the Rangers did so too before the older said, "All right then, so, what are you looking to chat with Hale and I about?" As Banks spoke, his attention went from me to something under the table between his legs. The 20-something Ranger Hale glanced at what his partner was doing and said lowly, "Give me some too." "Well, give me your canteen then," said Banks before stopping abruptly and looking up at me. Hale stopped in the middle of unclasping the canteen from his belt to look at me. Banks raised what was between his legs somewhat hesitantly as both looked at me, exposing a wide metal flask and a hollow green military canteen. "You don't mind if we indulge a little, right?" asked Banks before Hale added, "Rough night, hair of the dog and all that. These men were definitely rangers. I remember meetings between deputies and chiefs, rangers and wasteland mayors or chieftains that couldn't start until everyone with a ranger badge had at least 2 swigs of a local moonshine or ancient whiskey." I smiled a bit wider. "By all means, you'll get no judgment from me." Banks gave his partner a sharp nudge again. "I knew I'd like this fella. Ha!" They both chuckled and were much more open as Banks finished his canteen and turned to Hale's on the tabletop. "You got something about you, Padre." "I like it," added Banks, back to calling me Padre, and finishing off Hale's canteen with the last of the flask. Both Rangers took a swig, and Hale's eyes grew slightly wider as he lowered the canteen from his lips and gestured the canteen towards me. With memories full of past Rangers I knew from that life, I shook my head. "I'm all right, thank you, though." Hale shrugged and took another swig as I added, "You boys should add a completely dried prickly pear fruit to each of your canteens. It does something to it, makes one into 4. Good for a hike, and you can literally taste the desert in a good way." I stopped. Both men were frozen, and I suddenly wondered if I made an enormous mistake. Now the older ranger, Banks, looked like he could have been in the Rangers as long as I would have been if the new Canaanites hadn't found me, but I didn't recognize his face when I first saw them. Ranger Hale looked as though he was probably in his mid to late teens when I first came to this community, so I wasn't worried about him recognizing me from my past. Still, my reference to a little tradition amongst those of the Desert Rangers, specifically those Rangers operating in the Sonoran Waste, was incredibly dangerous. If I was considered a Ranger deserter, rather than KIA, that I was most likely assumed to be. The men were both looking at me with curiously raised eyebrows, clearly stuck in thought as I wondered what I could add to stop them from thinking about who I was further. At last, Ranger Hale turned to Banks and asked him, Doesn't Calderwood do that with his canteens? Banks was nodding his head in contemplation before he answered, "Yeah, I think so." Suddenly it hit me. I heard from some other rangers that was a good thing to try out in the desert where alcohol is scarce. I also wasn't always sober. I knew I didn't need to add that last part, but both were true. I did in fact hear how to do that from other rangers, but I didn't feel the need to say I heard about that tradition while I was in the rangers. However, my words seemed to work as a distraction since they both shrugged and Banks said, "Huh? I should try that." Hale nodded at this, looking over my shoulder. Just then Banks looked to me and added, "So anyway, what was it you wanted to talk about?" As I looked at the dusted faces of both rangers, the close brush with my old life made me consider the present. And I thought of how it was these men who brought my friend's daughter back home in the condition I saw. All business, I looked into these men's eyes, knowing that my past with men like them was just that. The past, and told them both. "I understand that you were the men who brought that girl in from the desert around noon yesterday." "Michelle, huh?" interrupted the younger, still smiling. But that smile was less now that they both knew the subject of the meeting. I was about to go on when Banks's face became more serious but sympathetic as he asked, "You her dad or something, Mr. Mathers?" Hale nudged his partner. She said her last name was Young, remember? I interrupted again. "No, I am not her father, but I am close with the family. Paul can't be here at the moment. I'm looking to minister to him when I see him, and I'm trying to help the family in the meantime, so I'd like to know more about what happened to her." I saw the hesitancy on their faces. "Don't tell me anything you're not comfortable sharing. I know this sounds strange, but I've seen her, and it might be best that her father doesn't learn too many of the details." Both men were nodding their heads in thought, probably thinking about the scene they arrived to when they found that poor girl and those she was traveling with. At the same time, Hale and Banks looked up at me. Hale looked as though he was going to say something, but stopped, and then they faced one another for a second before returning their focus to me. Finally, Banks said, "All right, we can tell you what's up. I don't know what there is to say if you ain't too familiar with the kinds of people out there, but if you'll excuse my language, Michelle and her group were set upon by a gang of real shits. Hale and I were headed up from St. George thereabouts when we found her lying near a rock off a desert trail several clicks.